Hello and welcome everybody. This is Niraj. I'm the host of the 2023 Breathwork Summit with the Shift Network and also founder of Soma Breath. And I'm super excited to dig deep on this amazing interview that we're going to have with none other than Stephen Elliott. So just before we begin, we're just going to get centered. I invite everybody who's watching this now, turn off all the distractions, clear the clutter, tune into this and tune into your breath just for a moment as we breathe in together. Take a deep breath in. Hold, squeeze all the muscles in your body just for a moment. And let go with a tone. And a sigh, good feelings. That's right. So we got an amazing guest here today. Stephen Elliott is an author, engineer, inventor, and a life scientist. But he's actually the principal author of 4 books and the publisher of the periodicals Coherent Breathing and Swan and Stone. And Stephen is credited with the development and articulation of the coherent breathing method and with the plethysmographic detection and biofeedback of the Valsalva Wave phenomenon. Wow, sounds super fancy. I can't wait to have that explained for us, leading to a breakthrough in the holistic understanding of the physiology of breathing. That's super epic. So since 2002, Stephen's quest has been to understand and expose the underlying physiology of essential hypertension, elevated arterial pressure with no known etiology affecting 60% of the adult population. Okay. A recognized pandemic before the COVID pandemic. Well, actually, strangely enough, the people who were most at risk from COVID, who ended up dying, were ones with heart disease and essential hypertension. So if you can prevent that, you're going to prevent most of the COVID deaths. Stephen posits that the quest is over. Yes. I.e. the underlying mechanics are now visible and verifiable. So I'm so looking forward to finding out what this is. Me being an ex-pharmacist, I gave up the profession because I didn't feel like we were making anyone better. I turned to breathing because it helped me heal from a chronic illness. So I'm so glad when I meet people who are putting science to such simple things. It's amazing. And to help spread the word so that we can actually put an end to what is really the number one pandemic in the world, which is heart disease. Most people, that's the number one cause of death. So we can prevent that. We're going to do a good job. So Stephen, welcome.
Thank you, Niraj. Nice to be here.
Yeah. Super glad to dig deep on this. It's definitely a passion of mine, this subject. So good. You actually have many patents, actually. I was going to say you have a patent and application, but you actually already have 19 US patents in the fields of biofeedback, breathing, electronics, mechanics, telecommunications. That's very impressive. So what you're saying now is that you've actually got a patent application on the trail of essential hypertension in the early 2000s, and your patent, having been filed in January of 2005, is something now Omron are actually interested in, and GE.
Yes, I'll tell the story as we go here in this presentation.
Yeah. So for those who don't know what Omron is, Omron make the blood pressure monitors that are very popular around the world.
Yeah, they're a global giant in the health monitoring field, hospital grade and consumer grade monitors and instruments.
Amazing. So you got a little presentation for us all about
I do.
Sweet. Let's do it.
Start to finish, sort of 2005 until now.
Brilliant. Looking forward.
Thank you very much, Niraj. The title of my talk today is Essential Hypertension, a 20-year quest to end the pandemic before the pandemic. As you said, this is a global and universal pandemic that did exist before COVID and is one of the comorbidities that is highly related to COVID negative outcomes. Quickly, a few references. I won't go through them, but they are here in the presentation for the viewer's consideration. The National Institutes of Health and Centers for Disease Control are important ones. The contents of my talk, one, essential hypertension, hypertension and essential hypertension. What are they and what is the difference between them? The global stats on essential hypertension, circulatory physiology 101, if you will, leading to essential hypertension and its root cause, which we believe we have found, and a brief history of our efforts over the last 20 years to shed light on this pandemic and the root cause thereof. I would like to make sure that I acknowledge Dee Edmonson, RN, BCIAC-EEG. That is, she is a specialist in EEG neurofeedback and really biofeedback of all types. Dee has employed coherent breathing with more clientele or clients than anyone on Earth, probably somewhere on the order of 40,000 individual sessions with clients using coherent breathing since about 2004. This talk, I've given it before, is dedicated to those that will listen. This is not unlike hearing about breathing, where it's not enough to know, one must act to gain benefit. And to gain benefit here regarding mitigation of essential hypertension, one must act. So quickly, terms. On the left is a view of what the heart is doing in time. This is recorded using Coherent's Valsalva Wave Pro, and this is a plethysmographic depiction of the heartbeat detected at the earlobe. So this is the heart contracting, the peak of that contraction being referred to as the systole. And this is what moves blood out of the left ventricle into the arterial tree. This is the heart contraction and ejection of blood into the arterial tree. And then after a contraction, the heart relaxes. And these points along the bottom are those points of relaxation known as cardiac diastoles. So when we measure blood pressure, we're measuring the difference between the peak here, the cardiac systole, and the cardiac diastole. And that gives us the typical number of 120/80. So nominally 40 millimeters of mercury difference in the average adult between systole and diastole. Now, when I say the average adult, I mean one that is not suffering from essential hypertension, one that is normal, if you will. On the right is the National Institutes of Health current classification of what is normal, what is elevated, and what they call high blood pressure. Notice that a term essential hypertension is not in this table. And this is part of the problem. It's vague and obstructed from view and understanding, but we'll talk about how and why that is true. Normal pressure is seen as that with systolic pressure less than 120 and diastolic pressure less than 80. So when we have our blood pressure taken either manually in the auscultatory method with a stethoscope and a cuff, or with an automated instrument, an oscillometric pressure instrument, for example, it's doing the same thing. The readings that we want are less than 120 and less than 80. Elevated arterial pressure, according to the NIH, is systolic pressure above 120 and not above 129. And then diastolic pressure still less than 80. This definition has changed in the last 5 years. And then high blood pressure is defined as systolic pressure of 130 millimeters of mercury or higher, and diastolic 80 millimeters of mercury or higher. This is the website where this information table was taken. So some alarming material from NIH. This is new, last updated July of 2022. I had copied it from the NIH website yesterday at this address. A few things I'd like to point out, those in red. Second paragraph, hypertension has been among the most studied topics of the previous century. Here we're talking about the 1900 to 2000 century, and has been one of the most significant comorbidities contributing to the development of stroke, myocardial infarction, heart failure, and renal failure. And we know atherosclerosis as well. It's a key contributor to that throughout the body. A little further down, etiology. Most cases of hypertension are idiopathic, which means in the speak that they have no known etiology or cause. We'll find those precise words on the NIH site if we look around, but this is the problematic and the current definition of essential hypertension, that it is elevated arterial pressure with no known cause. And it affects 2.6 billion people in the world. Epidemiology, sentence one, more than 1 billion adults worldwide have hypertension, with up to 45% of the adult populace being affected with the disease. If you tabulate the adult population of the world, 45% of that population is 2.6 billion people, not 1 billion people. Second red line here, data from 67 countries reported hypertension as the leading cause of death and disability adjusted for life years worldwide since the year 1990. And in the US, it accounts for more vascular disease than any other modifiable risk factor, and is second only to cigarette smoking as preventable cause of death for any reason. Notice they say a preventable cause of death. But what is the prevention that's being offered? And toward the bottom, pathophysiology. This statement is one that has been on the NIH website as long as I've been looking. There are various mechanisms described for the development of hypertension, which includes increased salt absorption. And so they advocate the abstaining from the use of salt because it can contribute to elevated fluid levels in the body, and with that, elevated arterial pressure. I say that salt sensitivity is due to the failure of the blood in the body to move. When the blood in the body is moving, salt doesn't matter. In fact, our blood is salty like the sea. It is an internal sea, if you will, that is highly saline in nature. Here is the share of population by age group. I won't dwell on that. This is where I got the 2.6 billion adults that exist in the world. Quickly, some stats. Cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death in the modern world today. This was a stat before COVID came, but COVID builds on the comorbidity of hypertension and cardiovascular disease. It's strongly related to many other diseases that are branches of this disease tree that the medical industrial complex treats with a different protocol. They don't treat the root cause; they treat the oncoming consequence of hypertension. These being stroke, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, nephritis, and a myriad of other health consequences. Hypertension, high blood pressure, is the #1 mortality risk worldwide. This number of 900 million is old. I gave this presentation the first time in around 2012. That number came from there. resulting in approximately 9 million deaths each year, including heart attack, stroke, aneurysm, etc. The stats A, B, C, D, E, F, you can see some alarming stats there. 65% of Americans over 60 are experiencing hypertension. There's a growing percentage of children under age 18, under age 20 that are presenting hypertension. This is a relatively new phenomenon. That was not true 25, 30 years ago. The disease, if you will, is resulting in filling of our hospitals, filling of doctors' offices, accounting for many deaths, 31,000 deaths in the US in 2013 as a consequence. This number could be multiplied many times if we look at the myriad disease outcomes and the deaths associated with those. And of course, it affects a huge percentage of the global population at a massive annual cost. In 2012 timeframe, the annual cost of hypertension was estimated to be $93 billion. And essential hypertension, being 95% of these cases, results in a cost of $88 billion. This message, 95% of hypertension cases have no known etiology. So while there are a billion people, billions of people with essential hypertension, or with hypertension, 95% of those cases are of the essential type with no known etiology. And in general, the outcome is for the medical industry to medicate these cases of elevated arterial pressure with no known cause. Here is a screenshot I took from the NIH website yesterday. It happens to be a YouTube channel that they have up. And this particular page was about managing one's blood pressure because it puts your mind at risk, which is a bit of a new twist. I haven't seen this messaging coming from the NIH before, but it is a message that I've been promoting heavily for at least 10 years. And that is that hypertension is a symptom of suboptimal circulation and a symptom of suboptimal brain function. And if severe, of course, it can damage the brain, and of course, in so doing, damage the mind. But I'm a believer that, in fact, suboptimal circulation damages mental function by inhibiting proper brain function. We can talk about how and why that's true. So to understand this, we have to look at the way the circulatory system is understood by medicine and the way it's promoted to the public. It's a leading cause of confusion and part of the root cause of the problem. Here is a very typical depiction of the human circulatory system, where we see a sort of a vague network of arterial and venous distribution of blood throughout the body, the heart being central to this distribution. The left side being the high pressure side, the arterial side. That's the side that the heart pumps blood into the arterial tree, and between the heart and the arterial tree, that blood is distributed out to the capillary circulation throughout the body. The other side is the low pressure or venous side. The venous side has barely any pressure at all. A few millimeters of mercury result in the return of venous blood to the chest and the heart. So I argue that this whole thing is a problematic perspective. Why is it problematic? Because it prevents us from understanding the true physiology of how the circulatory system works and how blood flows in the body. Here is another vague description that I took out of my Bible of Physiology, this being Medical Physiology by Guyton and Hall, a monumental work, probably the most monumental work ever accomplished in the field of medical physiology. And it is the most widely used text in medical schools around the world, having been translated into many, many languages and in the hands of millions of students and or doctors. The figure on the left is page 3, figure 1.1. Quote, the general organization of the circulatory system. And you can see here how it is construed. That is, the arterial blood flows through the left heart, the red heart, and down through the primary organic systems of the body, through and then up the venous tree to the right heart, and then interacting with the lungs where they depict the lungs in a peripheral placement relative to the circulation. This is categorically incorrect and leads the public and the medical profession to the wrong conclusion about how all this works. This is a profound matter. It's hard to understand, it's hard to believe. But in my 20 years of investigation and speaking with medical professionals and others in the field, professors and the like, they do not understand the correct flow of circulation in the body. My figure to the right is my correction of how the circulation in the body works, where in fact all of the blood flows from the right heart through the lungs, directly through the lungs, out of the lungs and back into the left heart. And it makes this circle with every inhalation and exhalation. By that, I mean, there are 5 liters of blood in the circulatory system at large. And each time we inhale and exhale, that blood is moved. To make that point, I add to this picture the diaphragm. And the reason for that is the diaphragm is provides the pressure impetus for the venous blood to move, which is the crux of the matter. Here is a complete and accurate description of blood flow in the human body. Blood is meant to flow in a circle, that circle being from the lungs to the left heart, out through the arterial tree, through the pervasive capillary circulation, which itself is 25,000 miles of microscopic blood vessels in the average adult body, out of the capillary circulation, back through the venous tree, right heart, and back into the lungs, where it is carbon dioxide is exchanged for oxygen. There are 5 liters of blood in the average adult body, but notice 42 liters in total of fluid in the average adult body. Most of us think and understand that our bodies are full of blood. If we cut ourselves, first thing we see is blood. But in fact, a small percentage of the fluid in the body in total is blood. The remaining fluid is the bulk of it is in the cells proper, estimated at 100 trillion in number in the average adult body. Those cells contain 28 liters of the 42 liters of fluid in the body. The interstitial or extracellular fluid is another 9 liters. That's the fluid in which the cells float and survive. It is their aqueous environment. The interstitium, now recognized as the largest organ of the body, larger in fact than the skin, fills this area and facilitates the flow of interstitial fluid to and through the body, and lymph and other fluids as well. So what's missing in this picture is the fact that the diaphragm is moving up and down, and the diaphragm is the muscular action that compels the venous blood to move. If we look at the high pressure side, The arterial blood is compelled to flow primarily by the muscular action of the heart contraction and the arterial tree, which is also muscular and facilitates through contraction and relaxation and nitric oxide stimulation. It makes sure that the blood is distributed adequately in real time throughout the body. Nitric oxide being a major signaling mechanism by which that's accomplished. But the root cause of essential hypertension is here on the venous side. That is, the mechanism to cause this blood to return under extremely low pressure, a couple of millimeters of mercury, is the diaphragm, the muscular action of the diaphragm. Without the diaphragm and its muscular action, there is no other muscular action compelling the venous blood to move except for the right heart. That is the contraction of the right heart, which will tend to create a vacuum to which the venous blood will return. But this is not the purpose of the right heart. The right heart's job is to check the blood and move it into the lungs. The job of returning venous blood to the chest and heart and lungs is the diaphragm, which is a large, strong muscle. So here is the complete explanation of essential hypertension and how and why it happens. I'll lead us through this because this is central to the talk. Point number one, blood flow in the venous tree is dependent on the depth of inhalation. When we inhale deeply, it moves our diaphragm downward. And with that downward movement, we see that the lungs fill with a large volume of blood. The lungs are capable of holding a maximum of 900 milliliters of blood, theoretically. This is the deepest inhalation that is possible. And when we exhale, then the lungs empty that volume of blood into the pulmonary vein and out to the left atrium, ultimately to find its way through the left ventricle and into the arterial tree. And when we exhale fully, we eject something on the order of 700 milliliters of blood maximally from the lungs. So the act of inhalation and exhalation is drawing a large volume of blood out of the venous tree through the right heart into the lungs with every deep inhalation. Now, we know that the population at large does not breathe in a healthy way, much less an optimal way. And part of the reason that this is true is there is general failure to breathe slowly and deeply. And when we do not breathe slowly and deeply, of course, the diaphragm does not move downward with significant depth, and therefore the blood in the venous tree languishes. So here we are with blood in the venous tree sort of sitting there as opposed to flowing in a circle freely, as it should when we are breathing at a resonant rate, where there is no inhibition to blood flowing freely in a circle. When blood languishes in the venous tree, the capillary blood, notice, has nowhere to go. So the capillary blood in the body also languishes. You see this in heart failure scenarios where the fingers and the extremities begin to turn blue. This is from failure of the capillary circulation moving. When the capillary circulation then has nowhere to go, the arterial blood has nowhere to go. And the autonomic nervous system knows that the arterial blood is not moving. It knows this by baroreceptors that exist throughout the body, and in particular at the left and right branches of or inner and outer branches of the carotid arteries in the brain, both left and right sides. These are the major baroreceptors that result in heart rate variability. That is modulation of the vagus nerve and the consequence being heart rate variability. So this backed up situation, what in traditional Chinese medicine is referred to as blood stagnation, is the primary cause of essential hypertension. And one can prove it simply by putting a blood pressure monitor on one's arm and measure their blood pressure and then breathe slowly, deeply, and rhythmically, in my parlance, coherently, and measure the blood pressure again, and we'll see a significant drop, typically in the diastolic pressure, but it can also reduce the systolic pressure. So as long as people are breathing suboptimally, the pandemic of essential hypertension is going to be with us. In the big picture, we know that every cell in the body depends on circulation to perform properly, if not optimally. But what is not clearly understood is that circulation is dependent literally on breathing, specifically on the depth of inhalation. Because without inhalation, as I previously said, the blood in the venous tree doesn't move, and then the blood in the body doesn't move properly. All of this ultimately results in the ill health of the 100 trillion cells throughout the body, including those of the brain, where I argue that the arrangement of the human body, circulatory system, is such that the circulatory system has the imperative to move blood upward to the brain against gravity. This is the reason that the human circulatory system, including what I refer to as the thoracic pump, that is the thoracic cavity with the heart and diaphragm at the bottom, which serves as a large secondary pump moving a large volume of blood to assist the heart and to make sure the blood is moving effectively against gravity. Now, as we're sitting here, gravity is trying to move our blood downward to our feet, and our breathing is causing the blood to move upward to the chest and then ultimately upward to the brain as it moves out through the arterial tree and up through the ascending aorta to the brain. So hypertension and essential hypertension, and I have a history of about 20 years, and I'm going to lead you through that very quickly. In 2005, I applied for an NIH grant to study the relationship between breathing and hypertension. And the reply I got back from that grant application was, bang, rejected. And I got a page of comments back from the panel that had reviewed my grant. And one of those comments was, we already know that this is true. So this was in the 2005 timeframe. Now, if the NIH already knew this was true, what have they done about it? What have they communicated to the public at large about it? Later, after my rejection, I engaged in a dialogue via written letter with Francis Collins, who you may recognize that name. He was head of the NIH during the COVID pandemic. He's since retired. He was head of the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at the time that I was dialoguing with him. And I wanted to know, I wrote and asked, why have you not communicated to the public that breathing is a key factor in the mitigation of essential hypertension? And we went back and forth a few times. And finally, I wrote and accused the NIH of lying by omission by not informing the public that this was in fact true. And he ended the communication with the statement that that suboptimal breathing is being taken under consideration as a causative factor. Also in 2005, I applied for a US patent on the detection of the breathing induced wave in the circulation using the oscillometric blood pressure monitoring method. This is the method that is commonplace today, where we can buy the instrument from the drugstore I'll show you a couple of these in a moment, and use it to assess our blood pressure. Now, what my invention proposed is that they modify the oscillometric blood pressure monitors at the time to detect what happens when we take a deep breath. Here in the center of this chart is what the oscillometric blood pressure monitor sees when we're not breathing deeply. And you can see the cardiac systoles and diastoles, they don't vary very much, nor does the frequency of the heartbeat. There's not much heart rate variability going on in this shallow breathing scenario. This is one that I created for this chart. Here at the beginning of this is a significant breath, one coherent breath, inhalation and exhalation. And you can see what happens with the cardiac systole and diastole when we take a deep breath. If these blood pressure monitors would pay attention to what's going on in this frequency range, they would detect this systole and this diastole, and they would inform the user and or the doctor that breathing is contributing substantially to the outcome of the blood pressure measurement. So this is what my patent was about. It was awarded to me in 2008, at which time I approached both Omron, a global giant in this field around the world, and both in hospitals and in consumer products, that is your local drugstore and doctor's offices. And I approached GE with the objective of having both of those global giants incorporate and or license my patent on detection of this breathing induced wave in the oscillometric measurement that their instrument takes. And the way it works, it works very much like the old school blood pressure assessment, this being the old school method being the auscultatory method, where we put a cuff on the arm and a stethoscope under the cuff, listening to the beat of the radial artery, where when the blood breaks through this and the pressure at which the blood breaks through and we hear these swishing sounds, this is the systolic reading. And we continue listening with the stethoscope until we don't hear any sounds anymore. And when we don't, that means that the pressure in the cuff is below that of the diastolic pressure as measured in the arm. That's where we get the systolic and diastolic pressure readings using the auscultatory method. And the the automated oscillometric blood pressure monitors today use that same method, but they do it automatically with electronics. In any case, neither Omron nor GE gave me really any impedance on this. I talked to product managers and they said, interesting, we'll be back to you. And then they were hard to reach from then on, and nothing ever came of it. In the end, I had to let the patent expire because I couldn't afford to participate in this space due to the FDA. It's a opening bid of $10 million to get FDA certification on an instrument, and that would include this one should I have built it, which I could not afford to do. So the patent expired. 2 years later, I find the first instrument that it has incorporated this detection, this being the GE Dynamap Pro. And here I depict it demonstrating 65 millimeters of mercury between the systolic reading and the diastolic reading. And the reason for that difference is depicted here on the left. This is the Coherence instrument, Valsalva Wave Pro, on which I own the patent on detection and biofeedback of this holistic circulatory wave, which we've dubbed the Valsalva Wave. And what's happening with this instrument now is it's paying attention to the systole at the peak of the respiratory wave, at the peak of the Valsalva wave, and is paying attention to the diastole here at the very valley of the Valsalva wave. The way the Valsalva wave works is it rises with exhalation when we're breathing slowly, deeply, and rhythmically, That's what generates this wave. And it falls during inhalation, rises during exhalation, falls during inhalation. So when we're using a blood pressure monitor like the GE Pro 400 V2, it will detect, when we're breathing slowly, deeply, and rhythmically, it will detect these peaks and valleys and tell us what our actual real arterial pressure is when we are breathing coherently. So a big breakthrough in the industry, and I think the medical profession at large, because it will now allow users and doctors to see that breathing has a profound effect on arterial pressure, and in particular, essential hypertension, and that it has the effect of lowering the diastole by about 30 millimeters of mercury. In 2008, with the writing of Coherent Breathing, the Definitive Method, I put forward the theoretical proposal that coherent breathing would add about 30 millimeters of mercury to the nominal blood pressure of 120/80, that being 40 millimeters of mercury. Add 30 to that, and we have 70. Here, in actuality, we have the GE Pro measuring the diastolic pressure at 57 millimeters of mercury, the difference between the two being 65. So I was close in 2008. These instruments are behind me. I can show you briefly what they look like. Let me complete this explanation, and then we'll turn and do that. So the important point is, notice that it is the diastole that is dropping significantly. And again, why? The reason is that when we inhale deeply, the lungs are storing a large volume of blood. We'll say 500 milliliters, which is, note, a tenth of the total blood in the body is in the lungs when we inhale deeply. As we exhale, that same blood begins to leave the lungs, now oxygenated. But at the peak of inhalation, the lungs are storing a large volume of blood, which can be as large as 750 milliliters combined. That's a wine bottle full of blood that is in the lungs when the blood pressure is being assessed in the arterial tree. So we've taken a lot of blood out of the arterial tree and capillary circulation when we inhale deeply. That's why the diastole drops. With that, let me turn and share with you what these instruments look like. I can't demonstrate them in operation at the moment because I'd have to get my camera and everything together to do that. But this is the GE Pro 400 V2, otherwise known as a nurse on a stick. This is the funny name that it has in hospital terms. And the reason for that is that it has the blood pressure cuff, it has a pulse ox, and it has a thermometer. So it is the instrument that's sitting next to your bedside in the hospital while you're interned there. And it's connected to the nurse's station, so they know anytime if you have a biomeasure that's going off the charts. It measures blood pressure every 30 minutes or so automatically and reports that. It so happens that this version of the instrument records the pressure of the Valsalva wave. A second instrument that I have discovered in my own doctor's office is the Omron, a recent version of the Omron instrument. What it looks like when you start it up. This is the Omron BP 5450. Here it goes pumping up, but I don't have a cuff in my arm, so it can't show us. But if I did have a cuff on my arm and I was breathing coherently, it would depict the Valsalva wave pressures, peak and valley. So again, I consider this a monumental breakthrough in the honesty of the manufacturers of blood pressure instrumentation, in that they are introducing the reality of the matter to the public at large. And my own doctor that I've been seeing for 25 years, since I moved to Texas in 1995, he is still not, he doesn't comprehend the relationship between breathing and blood pressure, doesn't really believe it, doesn't believe that one should breathe consciously, which is a pervasive issue in medicine. Here again is a zoomed in picture of the Valsalva wave and the difference then between the nominal blood pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury. Let's say this is 120, this is 80. Here it is peak to valley in total. That is the peak of the Valsalva wave to the valley of the Valsalva wave, which I theorize as being 70, and I have measured at 65 to date. And lastly, here is a very important study Dee Edmonson and I did. We began it in the 2007 timeframe and finished it in roughly the 2008 timeframe. During the writing of Coherent Breathing, the Definitive Method, the beginning of this study is described in that book. But this is the outcome, where our interest was understanding the relationship between the heart rate variability cycle and its amplitude and blood pressure, where the theory said that it isn't possible for the blood to be moving at a optimal rate and for the blood pressure to also be high. Do you understand what I mean there? It isn't possible for it to be flowing freely and for the blood pressure to be high. What causes blood pressure to be high is that it's not flowing freely. And our thesis was that the heart rate variability cycle, which we know now is a consequence of the Valsalva wave rising and falling in the circulatory system, is an indication of optimal or suboptimal circulation. So we wanted to do a study to correlate heart rate variability amplitude with blood pressure. And these are the samples we have. This is 42 clients, 102 measurements in total. The data has all been randomized and plotted here. And what we see right here is the 100 millimeters of mercury average blood pressure. That's 120 plus 80 divided by 2 gives us that 100. By the way, this is a measure that's starting to be popular in the medical field, which I'm glad to see. That is average arterial pressure. And right here at 13 beats, there's a major breakpoint where above 13 beats of heart rate variability, this is heart rate peak to valley. Here we're talking about 90 beats peak and 70 beats per minute valley. So a difference of, let's say, 20 beats of difference. This is what we're measuring here and plotting. So this axis is the beats different between peak and valley. And this axis is the average blood pressure. And above 13 beats, we find no instances of blood pressure above the average blood pressure of 100 millimeters of mercury. There is one on the line at 13 beats, but there's nothing above. The majority of our measurement instances are below 100 millimeters of mercury and above 13 beats of difference, which tells us that if one is breathing well and the heart rate variability cycle is significant in amplitude, then the likelihood of elevated arterial pressure is low. We also have a cohort below 13 beats of difference that is relaxed. Their heart rate variability is not very high, but they are relaxed. And we think that relaxation is contributing to the fact that their blood pressure is not above 100 millimeters of mercury. And lastly, the group that is experiencing elevated arterial pressure, their heart rate variability is all below 13 beats. So Dee and I believe that on average, if we can train our clientele to reach a heart rate variability amplitude above 13 beats, that their circulatory effectiveness will be dramatically improved, and their likelihood of experiencing hypertension, and specifically essential hypertension, that is hypertension with no cause, will be very unlikely. This being said, this study is not on the radar of modern medicine. Here is, lastly, the big picture of how blood flows in the body. I refer to this as Circulatory Physiology 101. Blood should flow in a circle. The heart and arterial tree move the blood outward to the extremities, and it is the job of the diaphragm to bring the blood back to the lungs and the heart. It is not the job of the right heart. And for the reason that many people are breathing suboptimally and not using significant diaphragm range, this is where the 20 breaths per minute or 19 breaths per minute in the average adult sampled comes from. The fact that their diaphragm is barely moving and definitely is not moving downward with significant depth. The blood in the arterial or in the venous tree is languishing. And then the job of moving the blood out of the venous tree back to the lungs falls to the right heart, which must then act as a vacuum pump instead of a check valve. And for that reason, about 60% of heart failures in adults over 60 years old, the failure is that of the right heart, because the right heart is worn out. The job of it has never been to move blood back to the lungs. That is the job of the diaphragm. So for us, if we fail to breathe with significant depth, and in particular, if we fail to inhale with significant depth, we are looking at a future of essential hypertension and or real hypertension in medical terms. So that was my message. Failure to inhale with depth is the root cause of essential hypertension, affecting 2.6 billion people in the world and costing the world hundreds of billions of dollars a year in myriad health consequences that ultimately stem from this root cause of suboptimal circulation as a consequence of suboptimal breathing. And that leads us to the end.
Wow. Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome.
Super deep. And I think some people are going to really lap up the science. For some others, it might be a little bit too scientific for them. But
sure.
In a nutshell, I think you summarized at the end that the inhale helps bring the blood flow back to the heart. So the heart doesn't have to work so hard.
That's correct.
Thus, help balance the hypertension or the blood pressure. So correct. That's awesome. So you mentioned Francis Collins, right? So
yes.
For those who don't know who he is, he was the director of the NIH, and he was caught up in a bit of a scandal with somebody you may know a bit more, Fauci.
Yes, Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Yes, and the scandal was basically that the clear fact that they were involved with funding the lab in Wuhan with gain of function research, right? So, they denied it, but they tried to cover it up, but it was uncovered as true. So do you believe, with that said, with somebody who's already shown in public to be not telling the truth, do you think that there is any kind of a conspiracy going on here, maybe?
Niraj, I'm not in general a conspiracist, but here I am certain that there is collusion going on in the medical industrial complex of the United States. There is no explanation for why this could be allowed to go on if the interest of the NIH and the CDC is really about health. In fact, the interest is in filling our hospitals. We continue to build more hospitals, grander, more expensive hospitals. We continue to invent new pharmaceuticals to mitigate the symptoms of this outcome. but they themselves introduce new complications and maladies. And then we need another medication to mitigate the side effects of the first medication.
Yes.
And on it goes.
Yeah.
So I have no other explanation except to say that the truth is not being told. Our tax dollars in the United States are going to this organization, in theory, to improve the health of the American public. But I do not see the truth of that being in effect in the messaging of the NIH. In fact, I see just the opposite, a cover-up of what the reality is.
I hear you, man. I've had similar challenges myself being a pharmacist in that industry. So I got so many questions, but we've come pretty close to the end of time. But I do want to ask a couple of questions. The first one
Please.
is, can you just give us a basic coherent breathing exercise? Like how should they do it?
Sure. The protocol for coherent breathing is to begin with the original CD titled Respire 1. It came with the book, The New Science of Breath, and still does. And there is a track on that CD titled Vocal Instructive Sequence. Two Bells is also on that track. Two Bells is Coherence's global hit. We probably sold 1 million copies of that worldwide. But Vocal Instructive Sequence is the preferred learning track on the CD. And the reason for that is that it's very difficult for a listener to go wrong. And it's extremely simple and cost effective. So the protocol, as described in the New Science of Breath and elsewhere, is that one, sit comfortably, turn on vocal instructive sequence, which is me reciting, exhale, 2, 3, 4, inhale, 2, 3, 4, to a babbling mountain brook that I recorded at 13,000 feet in the background. And that fades in and then fades out over the course of about 24 minutes. And the protocol is that one should listen to that track every day for 3 weeks straight, which is the Maxwell-Maltz protocol for establishing a new engram or a new, I don't like the word habit, but a new way of being. And coherent breathing, the system and method, is really about realizing a new internal state. And in particular, that new internal state involves homeostasis and self-governance. So we learn to breathe coherently as a consequence of what we experience during this 3-week period of practicing that track 1 time per day. This being said,
is there a specific breathing rate?
Yes, coherent breathing, the specific rate is 0.085 hertz. And that turns into 5.1 breaths per minute. It turns out in the long run that that is slightly lower than the accepted resonant frequency of the average adult, which is 0.1 hertz on the nose. And no matter what breathing rate we use, if we look at the frequency spectrum of our breathing, we will find a 0.1 hertz component there. It's something the autonomic nervous system generates. And if we breathe precisely at 0.1 hertz, we'll find that the amplitude of the power spectral density of the recording is very high, and that it's building on the 0.1 hertz. I discovered what I eventually named coherent breathing through my quest to find a instrumented methodology that would yield the awakened mind EEG. And that's in fact what I was doing as I was practicing the awakened mind EEG training every morning, instrumented with 3 or 4 different types of instruments. And I was trying to find, breathing was a central part of this. And I found moments where the illicit mind or the awakened mind would be prominent. And I kept diving into what are the physiologic mechanisms that I'm doing that turn that on and off. And in the end, that was breathing at this rate that is slightly below that of autonomic balance, which in effect puts us in a relatively parasympathetic state, and hence the meditative mind is elicited even while we're awake with eyes open and active throughout our day. And secondly, learning to relax these zones that I've referred to as bridges. There are 6 bridges in the body. The exercise or method is part of the coherent breathing system. It's called the 6 bridges, and they are the head and face, the tongue and throat, the hands, the diaphragm, the pelvic floor, and the feet. We learn to relax these zones by listening to a musical track that is running at 0.075 hertz, slightly slower, 13.3 breaths per minute, as opposed to 5.1, and a rate of 13.3 divided by 2. So a slightly longer period than upright coherent breathing practice. But it's meant to be practiced horizontally, which is why that frequency is slower. But so we learn to breathe at this rate. And once we've done that 3 weeks of work, then we segue to the practice of the 6 bridges, learning to find these locations in the body, become aware of them, melt them away consciously, which coherent breathing allows this to melt away anyway. And once this melting starts, we aid it by consciously addressing these zones and relaxing them as deeply as possible with this musical assist in the background. And having combined both of those practices, now we're in the complete state of coherent breathing, if you will.
Beautiful. So did you say 5.1 breaths per minute?
Yes.
5.1 breaths per minute. Okay, that's a key. That's a key metric.
That's the key to
and
moving
equal inhale and exhale times.
Equal inhalation and exhalation. The ideal pattern is that of a sine wave.
Sine wave.
There is no hold. Yeah, it's perfectly sinusoidal, and I have recreated a perfect sine wave in my own arterial Valsalva Wave recording that I've mapped right on top of a 0.085 hertz sine wave generated by an adjuvant signal generator. So it is completely possible that with precise control of the diaphragm, we can produce a perfect sine wave in our circulatory system.
Amazing. Well, Stephen, we could talk all day about this, but for people who want to go deeper, find out more, where's the best place?
Coherentbreathing.com has been the home of coherent breathing now for about 6 or 7 years. It used to be coherence.com, but of course the method is known worldwide as coherentbreathing.com. So I moved over to that domain. But yeah, there you can find all of the materials and training courses and everything that we offer.
Fantastic. Definitely check that out. I'm going to be checking it out myself. So Stephen, thank you so much. This has been super fascinating. Really,
thank you, Niraj. Appreciate the opportunity and best wishes.
You too. Peace.